Now is the time to get into Super Nintendo games. Eight-bit joystick. Nintendo captured the magic of their 8-bit systems and brought it to more powerful 16-bit hardware. The Super Nintendo Super Famicom was able to power 2D video games with detailed graphics, brilliant colors, advanced sound and music, and a controller layout that directly inspired the PlayStation and almost every modern controller. The real strength of the Super Nintendo is that it gave experienced game developers an opportunity to make new entries into series and genres that were first established during the 8-bit era, but with even more powerful tools to deliver more refined 2D games that were not possible on 8-bit hardware. That's one of the reasons why the 16-bit Super Nintendo has such a warm place in my heart, is because of great game developers like Capcom, Konami, Square, and Nintendo got to revisit the creative, ambitious games that were started on 8-bit hardware, and they were able to deliver truly phenomenal 16-bit experiences. Globally, there were 1,750 games for the Super Nintendo Super Famicom, and North America saw 721 official game releases. There are so many phenomenal games for the Super Nintendo that absolutely hold up as timeless classics. These are the 15 games that I would recommend that you start with if you are new to Super Nintendo or are wanting to get back into playing Nintendo's 16-bit era. I am sure that everyone has their favorite games that they would add to this list, and if you do, then post a comment below and let me know. I would also greatly appreciate it if you would consider liking this video and subscribe to this channel because I make weekly videos like this. Now, on to the games! Super Mario World. Super Mario World is not only one of the first Super Nintendo Super Famicom games ever made, it is the first game that you should get and play. It is the 2D Mario game where Nintendo got to implement all of the ideas that they wanted to do on the 8-bit hardware but could not due to technical limitations. You get the feeling that Nintendo's hardware team and software teams worked hand in hand to make sure that the Super Nintendo could handle exactly what the game developers wanted Super Mario World to be. Super Mario World is the pinnacle of Nintendo's 2D Mario games, and it features greatly varied world environments, excellent music and graphical effects, and really tight platforming and controls. There is new power-ups such as a super cape that allows Mario to fly, spin, and ground pound. And it introduces Yoshi, Mario's dinosaur friend, that he can ride on Yoshi's back. And there is some debate whether Mario is actually punching Yoshi's head when you have Yoshi stick out his tongue. And after eating certain enemies, Yoshi will lay an egg despite being defined as male. Gender is fluid and a spectrum in the Super Mario world. Nintendo actually built in various difficulty levels in the form of unlockable magic bricks that you can trigger by finding a big global switch. These provide power-ups and often keep you from falling to your demise. I am playing through the game on cartridge and not triggering any switches, and it is much more difficult and a great option when replaying it years later. This was a pack-in game for the Super Nintendo when it launched in North America, and it was also an incredible bestseller in Japan. It is a true timeless classic, and it is the pinnacle of Nintendo's 16-bit platformer design. Street Fighter II Turbo Hyper Fighting by Capcom. Street Fighter II was an unmitigated global phenomena when it single-handedly created a fighting game boom and a huge growth in arcades in the early 90s. When Capcom brought the game home, the Super Nintendo release was a smash hit. People bought the console just for that. Capcom later released an updated version of Street Fighter II Turbo, which allowed you to play the bosses and had faster speeds with more special moves. I was debating which version of Street Fighter II I would recommend in this video, but I think that Street Fighter II Turbo is going to deliver the fighting game fun like no other. Now, the Super Nintendo controller has 4 buttons on the front and 2 on the top. Street Fighter II requires 6 buttons, so they put the hard punch and hard kick on the top of the controller. Many people got used to it, and many people customized their button layout to how they liked it. Back in the day, I used to have light punch and hard punch on the controller and medium punch and medium kick on the top buttons. Now that I'm older, more mature, and I have no problem with the default layout that Capcom suggests. I also have the Capcom Soldier Pad, which has a 6-button layout and is quite cool. Capcom really put their experience and expertise with the Super Nintendo hardware into this version of the game, and it really shows as the best home version of one of the best fighting games of all time. Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. I would postulate that the Super Nintendo is where many Nintendo's gaming franchises really became what we know and love today. Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past is a truly perfect game. It was a return to the top-down Legend of Zelda layout and featured refinements to many of the mechanics that would go on to define the Legend of Zelda series. By using more powerful Super Nintendo hardware, they were able to deliver world building in the form of towns and people that you could talk to, and much more complex puzzles involving warping through dimensions, switches, and platforms. This game has been re-released over the years, but it still is an unmitigated classic and an incredible achievement in game design. I actually prefer the Super Nintendo version to the Game Boy Advance version because Link doesn't make as much noise in this one. The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past really pushes the Super Nintendo's graphics, and it also pushes your brain with logic puzzles that still put a smile on my face and makes me think some decades later. F-Zero. F-Zero is one of the best racing games of all time. The Super Nintendo game was the start of the F-Zero franchise and had fast and fun hover cars racing around a track. It really showed off what the Super Nintendo could do using its Mode 7 graphics mode. Mode 7 was a programming option in the Super Nintendo development kit which could allow for hardware-based rotation and scaling of background images that was really fast, so the background layers could zip around at an incredible clip and really created an awesome sensation of movement and speed. Mode 7 helped create the look and feel of many Super Nintendo games. For those of you who are only aware of the games made by Nintendo that were released in the US, it might be a little surprising to see Nintendo make a racing game at the start of the Super Nintendo. But if you consider that they made F1, Mach Rider, Famicom Grand Prix, Famicom Grand Prix 2, 3D Hot Rally, then it makes sense. However, Mach Rider was the only one that actually came out in the US. The difficulty curve in this game is excellent. Your timing needs to be precise, but the controls are so good that you really feel empowered. Decades later, F-Zero is still chef's kiss perfection. Final Fantasy II, also known as Final Fantasy IV. To say that Japanese role-playing games were a big deal to the Famicom is an understatement. The first 4 Dragon Quest games and the first 3 Final Fantasy games and a plethora of other wannabe role-playing games on the Famicom platform sold millions of copies in Japan, and it was a national pastime enjoyed by all. As a retro gamer, I consider all of the 8-bit and 16-bit JRPGs to be an untouched goldmine of retro gaming awesomeness. However, Square and Nintendo both tried very hard to get American gamers to get interested into Japanese-made role-playing games. Nintendo even distributed free copies of Dragon Warrior, also known as Dragon Quest, to subscribers of Nintendo Power Magazine. So, Final Fantasy II, as it was known on the Super Nintendo, was actually Final Fantasy IV in Japan. The second and third game in the Final Fantasy series stayed in Japan until recent releases. And then there also was Final Fantasy V, which also stayed in Japan. Later on, Final Fantasy VI was brought to the US as Final Fantasy III, so it was a little bit surprising to some when Squaresoft brought Final Fantasy VII over to the US and expected gamers to play catch-up with their rather eclectic numbering scheme. So, Final Fantasy games, for the most part, do not share a continuous storyline, but instead have similar themes, creatures, and items. Final Fantasy II is a really good one. It is their first game on 16-bit hardware and features some excellent, well-written characters, great music, and graphical effects, and has themes of destiny, technology, nature, redemption, and forgiveness. Physical copies of this game have really gone up there in price these days because Americans wouldn't become wise to the joy of JRPG RPGs until later on. The Super Nintendo and Super Famicom were home to some of the best role-playing games on the entire planet, and the advanced graphics of the Super Nintendo hardware allowed role-playing game creators to do some more creative things. I'm probably going to get some guff by leaving Final Fantasy VI off this list, but I really think the place to start is with Final Fantasy II, because this is where Square really got to cooking up some great games in Nintendo's 16-bit Super Nintendo Super Famicom kitchen. Super Mario Kart. Super Mario Kart for Super Nintendo is widely regarded as the first kart racing game, which is an often imitated genre, but you could really see where they were going based on their previous racing game experience with F-Zero and 3D Hot Rally. Mario Kart takes the Mode 7 graphical effects from F-Zero, but cuts the screen horizontally in half and allows for two-player simultaneous racing. Nintendo brought their ever-expanding line of Mario characters into a fun kart racing game with power-ups that you could use as weapons. These have a great equalizer effect, and Super Mario Kart is home to some of the best on-couch two-player gameplay action on the entire Super Nintendo. Every couple years, Nintendo makes a new iteration of Mario Kart on their latest platform, but the original game is surprisingly well put together, and its first outing on the Super Nintendo is essential. There's a lot on this list that is some basic bro pumpkin spice Nintendo goodness, but this is the stuff that really helped define Nintendo gaming experiences for decades to come. Super Castlevania IV. Super Castlevania IV is a perfect example of how Nintendo's switch to 16-bit hardware allowed experienced 8-bit developers to make more mature, advanced 2D games that weren't possible during the 8-bit era. Later on, when game developers tried to move to 3D hardware, they often failed to capture just what was so special about their 2D games. The Super Nintendo was just at the time where games could be two-dimensional and state-of-the-art. Super Castlevania IV is a retelling and reimagining of the original Castlevania games, which featured 2D platforming gothic action, but our hero can swing their whip in almost any direction and is much more nimble on their feet with the ability to change directions during a jump. When I started collecting cartridges again, I got back into playing cartridges on original hardware. I got a Japanese copy of Super Castlevania IV, and I found that the experience of playing it without save states, rewind, and other so-called modern conveniences gave it a heightened sense of tension due to the very real consequences of failure. Super Castlevania IV is tough but rewarding. It is one of the best looking and best sounding games on the Super Nintendo, and it is an essential game and an essential game series. It is magnificent and not to be missed. Super Ghouls and Ghosts. Super Ghouls and Ghosts was the third release in the Makaimura game series, but it was the first one that was actually developed by Capcom themselves, and was a new original game for Nintendo's 16-bit hardware. So, it is a cartoon gothic action game featuring a knight who can run and jump and throw weapons at cartoon bad guys in order to rescue a kidnapped princess. The gameplay uses double jumps to create some complex platforming action. The amount of bad guys that come at you is fast and furious, and I've often thought it is a platforming game which feels like a shoot-'em-up. Capcom delivered some of their classic 2D artwork as well as wonderful orchestral music on the Super Nintendo's more advanced hardware. Super Ghouls and Ghosts has a bit of the Gradius gameplay loop by having power-ups that you collect on your way and then punishing you for failure by robbing you of those power-ups after you get hit. Now, some of the first generation Super Nintendo games had a bit of slowdown as game developers got used to the Super Nintendo hardware. There is a bit of slowdown in this game when there are a ton of enemies on the screen, but is not as pronounced as Gradius 3. Super Ghouls and Ghosts is Capcom being creative and excellent. It delivers a new level of complex platforming gameplay. UN Squadron, also known as Area 88. Now, here is an entry that's going to surprise some people. The Super Nintendo was home to some truly amazing spaceship shooters, shmups, and this is one of the first shooters on the Super Nintendo that I fell in love with. It has basic RPG elements with experience power-ups and an economy system where you can purchase weapons and new planes. It is based on a really good manga, but still stands on its own. Area 88, or UN Squadron, is a surprisingly rich early Super Nintendo title. Chrono Trigger. By 1991, Square had been developing a series of very successful role-playing games that built upon the prior games, but mostly played it safe. A lot of the Final Fantasy games were iterative, so when it came to Chrono Trigger, Square designed a role-playing game which was wholly revolutionary. The story has time travel at its core and features multiple endings to the story, which now seem commonplace, but it was mind-blowing at the time. The 16-bit graphic engine gave Square text abilities to weave a ton of dialogue and really flesh out their characters. Character designs for Chrono Trigger was done by legendary manga artist Akira Toriyama, who just also happened to create character designs for Dragon Quest. I'm personally enjoying reading through the Dr. Slump manga. I know Akira Toriyama is most well known for Dragon Ball and fighting manga, but man, his comedic chops are impressive. The English copy of Chrono Trigger has really gone up in price, and it's strange that this game was never officially released in Europe until the Nintendo DS re-release. Chrono Trigger is beloved by its fans. The pixel art and characters, the branching paths encourage you to replay the game over and over again. Secret of Mana. Squaresoft took the opportunity to make some new games on Nintendo's new hardware. They had previously made Seiken Densetsu, also known as Final Fantasy Adventure for the Game Boy, which was an action-oriented role-playing game, and this is its much more well-known sequel. It is an action-adventure game set in a fantasy world with an over-the-top combat perspective. It had some real innovation in the use of rest and endurance. Your character can swing his sword quickly, but it's going to do very little damage compared to if you waited until you gathered your strength to really smack the cartoon bad guys. They also took advantage of the Super Nintendo's hardware and had additional characters that would help out your hero by fighting alongside them in real time, and you could actually use a second controller to have your friend control the characters for you. And you can even use the multi-tap to have 3 people play the game simultaneously cooperatively. Nintendo wouldn't even attempt to do a cooperative Legend of Zelda game until the GameCube era. Now, it's going to sound like I'm repeating myself to sing the praises of Squaresoft games on the Super Nintendo, but each one really was that good and pushed the boundaries of what an adventure game or role-playing game could be. EarthBound by Nintendo. Frequent modern criticism of Nintendo is often based around the claim that the company just keeps remaking the same games over and over again. This is absolutely not the case in the mid to late 1980s and early 90s, where the company created a plethora of diverse and fun games, and too often this creativity was left in Japan. EarthBound was initially a sequel to a Famicom-only role-playing game called Mother, or EarthBound Zero, that almost got an official release in the West and underwent quite a lot of official translation, but it was ultimately cancelled at the last minute in favor of bringing out its sequel, Mother 2, and calling it EarthBound. EarthBound is wacky, self-aware, and has a sardonic sense of humor. It is a role-playing game, but it's set apart with its modern setting and the fact that the heroes are kids that have psychic powers and use them to fight a looming evil threat. Nintendo would tantalize fans with a third game called Mother 3, which they also officially left in Japan. And it's only recent that the official Nintendo translation of Mother was brought to the Nintendo download services as EarthBound Zero. Copies of EarthBound fetch a hefty price these days because of a low print run, and also the game was never officially released in Europe before the Super Nintendo Classic. I'm personally enjoying a reproduction Kart which will fit in my Japanese Super Nintendo, but it was intended for the European gamer market. Fans of the EarthBound Mother series put the fan in fanatic, but their intense love for this wacky creative Nintendo game is not misplaced. EarthBound is amazing. Period. Complete sentence. Star Fox. Nintendo faced some serious competition from Sega and also NEC, and these competitors forced them to take some risky bets and to diversify their software lineup. This included a partnership with Argonaut Software and Rare, but more from them later. Argonaut Software were early pioneers in making three-dimensional graphics on underpowered 16-bit hardware. For the partnership, these British game developers actually traveled to Nintendo's headquarters in Kyoto, Japan, and helped develop a custom 3D processor known as the SFX chip that would be included on the Star Fox cartridge. This actually would be one of the first of many other Super Nintendo games that utilized special hardware inside the cartridge to pull them off. Star Fox is an on-the-rails 3D shooter, but it actually delivered simple shaded three-dimensional polygons during the 16-bit era and tied together various cartoon elements to make a creative and fun gameplay experience. It looks crude by today's standards, but I assure you that Star Fox was quite technically impressive back in 1993. Star Fox was before Virtua Fighter hit arcades, and it was before Sega and Sony got serious about making 3D games for home consoles. Sadly, there was a nearly finished sequel, and it had its release cancelled at the last minute, but surprisingly, Star Fox 2 got its official release on the Super Nintendo Classic Edition. Playing Star Fox isn't just required from a technical and historic perspective. It is still a freaking fun game and holds up despite being overpowered more than 1,000 times by modern 3D capable hardware. Playing Star Fox on original hardware takes me back to the summer of 1993 and delivers an incredible sensation of fun and awe. Super Metroid. Nintendo in the 1980s was a very avant-garde developer and had their own take on gaming trends. The Metroidvania genre did not start with Metroid and Castlevania, but by God, it was defined by those games. Super Metroid was a third Metroid game and was a follow-up to the original game on the Famicom Disk System and later NES cartridge, and then Metroid 2 on the Game Boy. But Super Metroid greatly enhanced the scope and world building. It is, in its nature, a science fiction action game that had a sprawling, interconnected world that is separated by various barriers that are resolved by finding weapons and power-ups. Exploration and looking over previous locations under a new light are what the Metroid games are all about. Super Metroid brings about refinement and polish to game design ideas in a way that it elevates it much beyond the sum of its parts. Donkey Kong Country. Donkey Kong Country is the result of Rare Software partnering with Nintendo. It utilized pre-rendered 3D graphics and animation programs to create a visually rich, fluid animated 3D characters that created the illusion that it was a much more powerful game running on existing 16-bit hardware. It is brilliant in its approach, and Rare combined this fluid character animation with really tight platforming controls to create a game which is innovative and invokes classic Nintendo platforming but looks completely new. It is an athletic running and jumping game like Mario Brothers, but it really feels new and unique. Rare took a similar graphical approach and used fluid pre-rendered 3D animation for the fighting game that they made for Nintendo, called Killer Instinct. The music of Donkey Kong Country goes phenomenally hard, and it is beloved for its creativity and emotion. Aquatic ambience has had a lasting impact on musical composition and has its own notable cult following. And it is just the music and a water level in a Donkey Kong game. This is the only Western-developed game in this video besides Star Fox. I think fondly on the partnership between Rare and Nintendo, and they produced some really creative and amazing games. Why play Super Nintendo now? The Super Nintendo games in this video are based on my own experience as a teenager. Looking over this list, it is pretty heavy on the early releases for the Super Nintendo, and I'm probably viewing them with rose-colored glasses. But I'm still going to recommend that you start with the beginning and then go on from there. That is why I recommend that you start with Final Fantasy II instead of Final Fantasy III. And that's also why I left off Super Mario RPG, because it's from much later in the Super Nintendo's life. You absolutely should play these later Super Nintendo titles, but I think that you would appreciate them more if you start with the earlier ones in the series, and with earlier games for the system. I also captured the gameplay footage in this video on original Nintendo hardware. I could have had it be super crisp using emulation, but I'm capturing these with original cartridges when available and hooked up my Super Famicom with an HDMI adapter, and I encourage you to play these games on original hardware if you can. How to play Super Nintendo games in 2024. There are actually a lot of different options on how you can go about playing Super Nintendo games. I don't want to repeat all the things that I said in my videos on essential games for the Sega Genesis and the Sony PlayStation, but a lot of it is quite applicable. Super Nintendo Classic Edition. You know, I could have made this video about the Super Nintendo Classic Edition because 80% of the games in this video are on there except for Chrono Trigger, UN Squadron, and Final Fantasy II. Tracking down a Super Nintendo Classic Edition is an absolutely excellent option. It has most of the best games, and it is an official release by Nintendo with perfect emulation and authentic feeling controllers. I will never understand why Nintendo doesn't make more copies of this great system or make an updated version with more games. Official software emulation. Nintendo is currently in the business of renting monthly access to emulation versions of these on the Nintendo Switch Online service. Personally, I would have preferred to actually buy them as a download or have them on cartridge rather than a subscription. But the Nintendo Switch Online service is great for people who want to try Super Nintendo games but aren't ready to get hardware versions. Unofficial software emulation. Nintendo games look amazing on my Mew Mini, and almost every single emulation platform, such as RetroPie, has no problem handling Super Nintendo games these days. Clone hardware. There are a number of excellent clone systems on the market. Personally, I like my Retron 3 HD, which does a great job of playing the Super Nintendo cartridges via HDMI. And I also made a review of an FPGA Super NT by Analog. It is a shame that they're not making it, and the secondhand price for it has really gotten ridiculous. At least you can actually buy a new Super Nintendo compatible Hyperkin Retron system these days without having to pay crazy eBay prices. Original hardware. Super Nintendo original hardware systems are relatively easy to come by these days. Now, there is a great deal of variety among the internal revisions of the Super Nintendo, and some of the older systems might have issues with some capacitors and older chip components which can fail with age. You definitely want to test a system out before spending your money on it. Some of the newer revisions tend to have better video output and are more reliable. The redesigned Super Nintendo Mini or SNES Junior does not feature RGB output, so you might run into problems using HDMI adapters and scalers that require it. EverDrives. An EverDrive is a great option if you want to play Super Nintendo games on original hardware or clone hardware, but you don't want to spend the time and money collecting original Super Nintendo cartridges. Some later Super Nintendo games did include some more powerful processor chips inside the cartridges, and a couple of the games that require them do not run properly off a standard Super EverDrive X6 like the one I have. It currently will play over 97% of Super Nintendo Super Famicom library. However, I've tracked down some original hardware copies of the handful of games that it can't play. But saving up for an FX Pack Pro is also a great option for an EverDrive that can play everything and has in-game save states, but it's over twice the price. Personally, I've tracked down copies of Super Mario RPG, Doom, Star Fox, and Yoshi's Island because those were the games that I was missing on my Super EverDrive X6. I am very pleased with my Super EverDrive X6, especially since it allows me to play the English versions of Super Nintendo games on my Super Famicom hardware. collecting cartridges. When I started collecting cartridges again, I mostly limited myself to Super Famicom and Famicom cartridges. Super Famicom cartridges tend to be much more affordable than their US versions. However, the cartridge slots on Super Famicom systems are smaller and do not have a way of playing American Super Nintendo cartridges on my Japanese Super Famicom systems. That is where the EverDrive comes in handy, as do the clone systems. Playing Super Famicom games on US Super Nintendos are as simple as breaking off the plastic tabs inside your Super Nintendo with a needle-nose plier, Dremel, or using a cartridge adapter or a Game Genie. Now, collecting for the Super Nintendo has gotten a lot more expensive in the past recent years, and there was quite a price increase at the start of the COVID shutdown. The proliferation of eBay inflation and price charting has really driven up the cost of retro games on the Super Nintendo. I would exercise caution before considering buying expensive games online. There are quite a lot of shops on AliExpress that are churning out some high-quality bootlegs. I wouldn't buy an expensive game until you can actually see the board first. Another option is to consider buying obvious bootlegs straight from AliExpress. Chrono Trigger and EarthBound were never actually released in PAL regions, so I purchased bootleg versions on AliExpress that will fit in my Super Famicom systems. But for some folks, there is nothing quite like the thrill of hunting down original cartridges, and the Super Nintendo has some amazing games. CRT TVs. However, if you're going to get into original hardware or clone systems that have analog AV output, then I would suggest getting a CRT TV. You don't even have to get a very powerful one. Almost any standard free or very low cost CRT TV that you can find in your area is going to do an absolutely amazing job of rendering 16-bit 2D graphics in glorious 720p Unreal CRT TV. By the way, the implementation of S-Video by the Super Nintendo is amazing, and if you could do S-Video for a compatible CRT TV set, then you are in for some great 2D CRT gaming. S-Video is about 95% the quality of component, but only a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the hassle. I'm also a big fan of the simple Hyperkin Super Nintendo HDMI adapter. If you want to hook up your original system to a modern TV with HDMI, since the standard Super Nintendo has RGB output, you can actually get a really decent picture via HDMI without having to pay for an expensive scaler. No matter how you want to play Super Nintendo games, now is an absolute great time to get into it. I would also greatly appreciate it if you would consider liking this video, subscribe to this channel because I make weekly videos just like this. This is 8-Bit Joystick. Stay awesome. Play retro.